Welcome to Crossroads. The United States has now announced, at least partly, a strategy to help defend Taiwan in the event of an invasion by the Chinese Communist Party. Now, this strategy would involve what are being described as classified capabilities as well as drone swarming technology. This is unmanned vehicles that could really be used to blunt any CCP invasion of Taiwan and also give allied countries time to reach Taiwan if needed. Now, look, of course, the United States has kept things somewhat vague on whether or not it would actually defend Taiwan in the event of a war, but they are putting things in place if that were to happen. Now, the current U.S. policy is more to help Taiwan defend itself, at least on the surface, by providing it with weapons and training it needs to defend itself against the Chinese Communist Party. But things may be changing as well. There are now signs that this policy may not really be set in stone, but let me start first with what's being described as the so-called Hellscape strategy. Now, this recently made headlines with the Washington Post. They had an interview with Admiral Samuel Paparo, the new head of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, of course, of the U.S. Navy. Now, Washington Post notes this. He said, Plan A is to deter Xi from ever attempting an invasion by making sure that he never looks across the Taiwan Strait and sees an easy victory. Of course, referring to Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, and his ambitions to take Taiwan very likely by force. A time frame on that they've set to at least, or at the very most, 2027, just a few years out. Now, they note that China's likely strategy is to overwhelm Taiwan with a massive attack with little warning, Paparo said, again, the admiral. They note that Xi Jinping doesn't want to repeat Russian President Vladimir Putin's mistake in Ukraine back in 2022 when Russia's initial full-scale invasion failed, and I'll explain that in a minute, and devolved into a long war of attrition. The key to thwarting Xi's assumed strategy is a U.S. strategy called, quote, Hellscape. And Paparo told this to the Washington Post. And notes the idea is that as soon as China's invasion fleet begins moving across the 100-mile waterway that separates China and Taiwan, the U.S. military would deploy thousands of unmanned submarines, unmanned surface ships, and aerial drones to fly to the area and give the Taiwanese and also U.S. partner forces time to mount a full response. And this is what the admiral said, again, the one in charge of that command sector. He said, quote, I want to turn the Taiwan Strait into an unmanned hellscape using a number of classified capabilities so that I can make their lives utterly miserable for a month, referring, of course, to the Chinese Communist Party, were it to try to invade Taiwan. And he added that that would buy him time for the rest of everything, meaning, of course, they can move the rest of the assets there and decide how to respond to it. Now, he added, I can't tell you what's in it, when he was pressed for details, but he added, it's real and it's deliverable. Now, let me detail this. I should note that while they're saying it's real and they can't detail, of course, what's actually in the plan, the U.S. military actually has had some announcements on it. This isn't the first time they've made it public. But let me step back a bit because it notes a few things. It notes that the Chinese Communist Party's leader Xi Jinping does not want to repeat Putin's mistake in Ukraine with the failures in its initial invasion. Let's go back in time, 2022, Russia's invading Ukraine. What happened? Well, you might remember the videos and the images of the extremely long line of Russian vehicles all stalled along a one-way road. They did not have proper logistics. They were getting flat tires. They actually blamed the flat tires because they were buying them from China, and it turned out that they didn't work as well as they were promised. A lot of the vehicles were stuck in the mud, and because of this, it delayed the entire invasion. Because the invasion was delayed, not only was Ukraine able to mount a defense, but the rest of the free world was able to come to Ukraine's aid and begin supplying with weapons and other assets to, again, prepare for the arrival of the main Russian fighting force. Logistics have become a nightmare in that war, especially, honestly, one of the one things you're missing? Well, you're missing medevac. You see helicopters, life-flighting people out. There are a lot of logistical problems there. Now, the initial agenda with that, at least on the surface strategy, was Russia wanted to roll in very quickly, take what they wanted, bring Ukraine to the negotiating table, and have the entire thing wrapped up very quickly. But because of that initial invasion and the failures of it, where again they were just stuck on the long road for a good while, that delayed everything and that dragged them into a long war. Now, if we compare that to the Chinese Communist Party, they're facing a very similar strategy and also very similar risks. The Chinese Communist Party's strategy, whether it's war with Taiwan, for example, or even some of its plans against the United States, is rapid surprise attack and then to immediately hit as hard as they possibly can and then get negotiations as soon as possible. And if the United States were to stall that attack, as this admiral is suggesting, while it would have a similar effect to what, again, Russia is experiencing in Ukraine, where that initial plan, that rush and that, again, very quick move to get negotiations failed. If that were to happen in Taiwan, the Chinese Communist Party would also find itself in a very difficult position. Now, on the point of the classified capabilities mentioned by the admiral in terms of what they would field against the Chinese Communist Party, we don't really know what those are. But on the points of using swarms of unmanned vehicles and even the so-called Hellscape strategy, these are actually publicly reported. In fact, Hellscape is not just a scary-sounding name. That's the actual name of the program that the military has been using, in fact, tied to a couple other ones. Let me show you this. This is the U.S. Naval Institute on March 11th. It says the Defense Department's early effort to build a small unmanned craft designed to stymie a Chinese invasion of Taiwan will cost about $1 billion, Deputy Defense Secretary Kathleen Hicks said on Monday. And notes that announced last year the Pentagon's Replicator Initiative. And I'll explain this. The Replicator Initiative contains the Hellscape strategy. This is the strategy they're fielding to defend Taiwan. It says the Pentagon's Replicator Initiative is an effort to quickly field swarms of unmanned systems to solve military problems faced by U.S. combat commanders. The first Replicator 1 tackles the problem of how to slow or defeat an amphibious invasion of Taiwan with massed lethal surface drones and overhead loitering munitions, USNI News has reported. Briefly on this, surface drones would, of course, be unmanned vehicles in the form of boats, right? Ships. And, of course, there's undersurface ones, unmanned submarines, and overhead loitering munitions. Those are more the, again, flying drones that would maybe be stagnant or stationary, working to spot targets or maybe drop munitions, as I say, munitions, fire on, drop bombs on ships, again, trying to cross the Taiwan Strait. When they say drone as well, this is different from a UAV, an unmanned aerial vehicle. UAVs tend to be controlled by an operator. Drones are autonomous, though, although they note these are semi-autonomous because you would still have an operator basically making sure that they're not going off, that they're not doing things they shouldn't be doing. And of course, when they have the fire orders and so on, that they can't just do it on their own. Now, it notes further in, though, that split over funding periods, the Pentagon has earmarked about $1 billion so far to fund the first round of the Replicator Initiative in two parts. Now, it notes that the loose total for the first iteration comes as the Pentagon is shifting its unmanned systems focus to swarming, attributable drones that can deliver in the near term and serve as a testbed for autonomy. They're operating on their own, rather than more complex legacy unmanned programs, where again you have an operator controlling the entire thing. Hicks told reporters on Monday. It notes further in that along with the mass of unmanned systems, DIU is also creating the software that will allow the lethal surface and aerial vehicles to swarm, find threats autonomously, operating on their own, and then allow a human being to make the ultimate decision to strike a target. Pulling the trigger is the only thing controlled by a person, in other words. It notes that last month, at least at the time, U.S. Pacific Fleet Commander Admiral Sam Paparo, the one who recently again spoke to Washington Post, said the Navy will stand up a new squadron for small unmanned vessels in May. In other words, it's already happened. He said, quote, "This is not a contractor-owned, contractor-operated capability," meaning they're not going to third parties for this. This is under the military itself. And he adds, "This is a uniform capability that will be able to own and operate unmanned capabilities that can be employed within particular spaces." Now, it notes that PAC Fleet has been experimenting with a concept known as Hellscape that dovetails with the Replicator 1 goals of suppressing a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Again, briefly, Hellscape is the strategy of using this to block the Chinese Communist Party from invading Taiwan. The Replicator 1 system is the technology creating these drone swarming systems, something that they're already apparently deploying. Now, look, it seems the system looks like it's on place to actually be active pretty soon. It's not some far-off concept. And this is important because, if they start talking about it and they're putting capabilities in place to prevent the Chinese Communist Party from actually invading Taiwan, well, you want to make sure it's there in place before you announce it so they don't try to invade beforehand. And of course, the other big question that a lot of people might have is, sure, they're talking about concepts to help defend Taiwan, but you got to actually do it. You got to have them in place. According to this is already in motion. Now, I'll be talking about more of this after a quick break.
Experts agree. One of the best ways to protect against financial uncertainty is to diversify your portfolio. Learn how physical gold and silver can secure your retirement funds from today's economic challenges with a gold IRA from American Hartford Gold. You can safeguard your wealth with no penalties or taxes when you transfer your current qualifying retirement accounts. Call now and our precious metals specialists will send you a free information kit, no cost or obligation. American Hartford Gold, a trusted industry leader with an A+ from the Better Business Bureau, has a 5-star rating from thousands of happy clients. Whether you are getting physical precious metals in a gold IRA or delivered to your doorstep, we offer only the highest quality gold and silver. For your peace of mind, we also offer a no-fee buyback commitment, a low-price guarantee, along with free shipping and free insurance. So don't wait. Call the number on your screen today and secure your financial future.
Welcome back. We're talking about the Hellscape program that the U.S. military is putting in place to help defend Taiwan against an invasion from the Chinese Communist Party. Now, the United States has again developed a strategy to disrupt the Chinese Communist Party if it were to try to take Taiwan by force. This is now being described publicly by the U.S. military as a, quote, Hellscape strategy, and it would involve classified capabilities as well as thousands of unmanned vehicles, including submarines, surface ships, and also, again, aerial vehicles. Its aim is to delay the Chinese Communist Party long enough for the United States and its allies to arrive, and of course for Taiwan to mount a proper defense were this to take place. Now, currently, it looks like the system is on pace to be active pretty soon, if it's not already, in fact. It's not some far-off concept. They're already putting this in place. The U.S. Naval Institute said in February, in fact, that the Navy will establish a second unmanned surface vessel squadron in the next few months, possibly already there as far as we know. It says as the Pentagon accelerates unmanned system development to tackle an expansionist China in the Western Pacific, a service official announced on Wednesday. And what's important here is that this unmanned drone swarming technology, it seems to be aimed, in all their public reporting at least, at the Chinese Communist Party. And briefly on this as well, one thing the U.S. military has been watching is, of course, the war between Russia and Ukraine. They've been watching what it looks like when a modern military, because the U.S. has been fighting insurgencies for the last couple dozen years. We've been fighting insurgencies, people who don't have tanks for the most part, or jets for the most part, or modern military weapons for the most part, although there are some that have it, like terror groups that get their hands on maybe Iranian weapons and so on. But for the most part, the U.S. has not really seen what it looks like when its military assets have to go up against a modern military. And we're seeing, for example, in Ukraine, that tanks and very big weapons, they tend to be very big targets and they tend to get destroyed. And so the focus has been shifting away from large, stagnant weaponry to smaller, more maneuverable ways of fighting. They're saying that drones, for example, unmanned vehicles, smaller weapons, cheaper weapons, ones that can swarm and attack, that these may in fact be more useful when it comes to modern ways of fighting. Now note that the 2nd Unmanned Surface Vessel Division will formally stand up in May. In other words, according to this, it's already in place. They say the 2nd Squadron will focus on small USVS, building on the medium and large USVS at the Unmanned Surface Vessel Division. One, which is USVDIV-1, has been experimenting with for the last 2 years, again, according to United States Naval Institute News. Now, briefly on this, when they talk about USVDIV and, of course, these different acronyms, they're referring to unmanned vehicles. And that refers, of course, to drones, not just to ones free of operators like we've been seeing that they have these UAVs where you have a guy controlling the thing remotely. These are mostly autonomous. The only thing controlled by a human, at least according to most of the reporting, is the fire orders. Now, the Hellscape program was also detailed pretty heavily by the U.S. Naval Institute not too far back, but last year in November. And here's what they had to say at the time. Now, U.S. Naval Institute, again, last year reported that to keep sailors and Marines out of the deadliest of Pacific crucibles, they want to overwhelm the invasion force, which would in this case be the Chinese Communist Party, with drones, lethal drones, to create what Pac Fleet calls Hellscape. The plan calls for thousands of lethal drones on, above, and under the sea. Again, surface ships, submarines, and aerial vehicles, creating chaos for the invaders, in this case the Chinese Communist Party. And they noted that, quote, enemy ships are getting damaged, slowing down, big timings are getting thrown off, meaning they're delaying them, of course. Again, talking about the strategy of delaying the invasion to, again, drag China into a long war if it does that. They say some are getting lost, referring to the chaos they'd be creating as ships are losing track and maybe trying to escape the chaos, and there's confusion and so on, right? They say some ships are probably going to get sunk, and you'd imagine that would not be that hard given that circumstance. Again, this is Clark telling USNI News last week, at the time, of course, last year. They say this hellscape, this strategy, this churn you cause in the invasion lets you mobilize, get your act together, and start delivering the long-range fires that are going to actually take out the larger amphibious ships and surface ships, he added. And notes the concept has been taken up by the Pentagon and folded into the overarching Replicator Initiative, the new weapon system being rolled out by the U.S. military. Again, drones, right? Large-scale drone fleets. It notes it announced in August last year by Deputy Defense Secretary Kath Hicks that the Replicator Initiative will help procure thousands of cheaper unmanned systems for programs like Pac Fleet's Hellscape. And they say, quote, will counter the PLA, that's the People's Liberation Army, the military of the Chinese Communist Party, will counter the PLA's mass with mass of our own, but ours will be harder to plan for, harder to hit, and harder to beat, Hicks said in a speech at the time. Now, one of the main strategies of the Chinese Communist Party is also swarming. The main power of the CCP is the fact that they have a whole lot of ships, a whole lot of rockets, and a whole lot of people. And of course, for the United States defending against just a mass of jets and a mass of ships and a mass of invasion vehicles, again, troop carriers coming across the Taiwan Strait, you wouldn't be able to take all of them out. And even then, of course, you'd have to move very quickly because the CCP would try to do it as quickly as possible. They would want to spend as little time as humanly possible in the very dangerous 100-mile Taiwan Strait, because that would be like a shooting gallery. They would want to get to Taiwan as rapidly as possible and get on ground as rapidly as possible and try to do that before Taiwan can mount a large-scale defense, and especially before other countries can decide whether or not they would come to Taiwan's defense as well. This drone fleet would aim to get them stuck in the Taiwan Strait, creating chaos. Again, going back to the name they've chosen for it, which is Hellscape. Confusion, chaos, and of course, ships being sunk. Now, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, they're pushing back and they're saying that the Hellscape strategy is, quote, wishful thinking. But the strategy would actually undermine at least a couple of the key scenarios the Chinese Communist Party may use if it does in fact try to take Taiwan. Again, the first big one being rapid invasion. It'd be very hard to rapidly invade if you get stuck in the Taiwan Strait. And the other being a quarantine using a naval blockade. And that is one of the main strategies that a lot of people, including myself in previous analysis, believe the Chinese Communist Party may try to employ against Taiwan, which is the other alternative to a direct invasion. Now, CSIS, they noted in a recent report that one major step China could take is a gray zone quarantine led not by its People's Liberation Army, in other words, not by the Chinese military, but instead by its Coast Guard and other law enforcement forces. And that's important because they say this: rather than sealing off an island, or the island of Taiwan, a quarantine would aim to demonstrate China, the CCP's ability to exert control over Taiwan, because the CCP claims to own Taiwan. They claim it's one China. And currently, at least, the United States still recognizes the quote-unquote one China policy. The difference being we recognize Taiwanese not Taiwanese independence, but Taiwan, again, being under a separate system from the Chinese Communist Party, although there's a lot of gray area in terms of how it's interpreted. But CSIS notes that a quarantine is more feasible for China and more likely than an invasion or blockade in the near term. It also represents unique challenges in terms of how Taiwan and the international community can respond. And why is that? Well, they explain it. They say a quarantine of Taiwan would represent a substantial escalation of coercion against the island, but it offers China several distinct advantages. First, a quarantine allows China to impose greater political and administrative control over Taiwan. They note that China's efforts to restrict air or maritime traffic to the island could allow Beijing to assert its sovereignty claims and demonstrate that Taiwan does not have control over its own claimed sovereign space. This could undermine Taipei, the capital of Taiwan, of course, and their ability to self-govern and erode the Taiwan public's confidence in Taiwan's military and Coast Guard. Because again, what they're saying essentially is it would force the rest of the world to decide whether or not they recognize the independence of Taiwan from the Chinese Communist Party. A policy that is, of course, represented by the incoming, currently in power now, Taiwanese government, where they've declared that Taiwan is in fact an independent country. Other countries have been a bit hesitant to follow that. In fact, they have reiterated that they do not recognize Taiwanese independence. Were the Chinese Communist Party to use that and say that, well, you don't recognize Taiwanese independence, then it's part of China, and we want to enforce law enforcement or quarantine over Taiwan, well, it'd be very hard for other countries to intervene unless they came out and acknowledged that they believe that Taiwan is an independent country. And that would, of course, be the narrative game the CCP could play, that gray zone again. Now, CSIS notes that second, on another part of this, China could use a quarantine to intervene in Taiwan's domestic politics by imposing economic costs on the island. They'd make it very dangerous for them, of course, very costly. Like, for example, a medieval castle siege. You cut off the supplies and you starve the city, essentially. In this case, starving them financially. And again, Taiwan being one of the main sources of semiconductors, that would, of course, impact the entire world were that to happen. They note that if the disruptions stemming from the quarantine are sustained for a lengthy period, elements within Taiwan society could leverage this to portray Taiwan's leaders as ineffective. In other words, they could use this to launch color revolutions within Taiwan. They could use it to create social chaos within Taiwan. They could use it to make the people of Taiwan try to turn against their leaders if they play the narrative game right alongside that surrounding blockade. And CSIS notes that this could either lead to a loss of public support for Taipei, the Taiwanese government, or increase political pressure on Taiwan's leaders to negotiate or improve relations with Beijing, the Chinese Communist Party. And it notes that a third benefit of this, in terms of why the strategy is feasible for the CCP, is they say that a quarantine is more limited in scope than a blockade or other large military operations. A quarantine led by China's Coast Guard is not a declaration of war against Taiwan. It's gray zone warfare, in other words. They say because a quarantine is not overtly PLA-led. It's not a military operation, in other words. They say there is a lower risk that escalation will lead to direct military confrontation because of that. And they note that if the quarantine is cast as law enforcement operations, China can easily announce the end of the operation and claim its objectives were met. Meaning that if the United States moves in and says, okay, we deem this illegal, we're going to defend Taiwan, China can say, well, quarantine's over. Why are you interfering in our affairs? And they just dissolve it. And then when the other countries turn away again, the CCP could do it again and just keep doing this back and forth until the whole world becomes numb to it, in other words. Now, they note that relatedly, China could choose to target only certain types of products, or the quarantine could be scaled to cover all air and maritime flows to Taiwan, meaning the CCP could essentially make a checkpoint for trade with Taiwan, or who gets in and who gets out. Now, of course, the CCP kind of tried this in other parts of the region. They've done it, for example, with attempted blockades and no-access strategies to the South China Sea and even parts of the airspace within that region. If the Chinese Communist Party were to try this with Taiwan, and if the United States applied its Hellscape strategy, for example, well, it would make it difficult or impossible for the CCP to keep its military just sitting in one place. Briefly on this, let's imagine, for example, that the CCP tries to field all these military assets around Taiwan. If the CCP were to cross the threshold that would constitute direct military action, and if the United States were to deem that, again, an invasion force or whatever, it would, of course, activate the Hellscape strategy, and the CCP's military would be probably at least heavily damaged, or at the very least heavily delayed. The Chinese Communist Party, because of the Hellscape strategy, would not be able to blockade Taiwan using military assets. But again, the other possibility, aside from the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, doing it, would be, as this article notes, the Coast Guard or the Chinese police. And that would again create a gray zone. Then you'd have the question of rules of engagement. The United States probably would not fire on those ships because it would not be a declaration of war. But the United States has also dealt with gray zones like this before, notably with the Chinese Communist Party. Because what is the Chinese Communist Party doing? When the CCP declared ownership over almost the entire South China Sea by claiming first an Air Defense Identification Zone, an ADIZ, which means that they claimed territorial ownership, and they even demanded that if commercial airliners with passengers on board are flying through the region, that they have to request permission from the Chinese Communist Party because they claimed it was Chinese airspace. They started creating that pressure even on, again, passenger airplanes, let alone, of course, military airplanes. If military jets fly through that area, which was deemed previously, again, an international zone, and is still recognized as being international by all countries other than the CCP and its main allies, while the CCP would scramble jets, fighter jets, to follow them, they would harass them, they'd go after them. They didn't shoot them down, of course, but they would pressure them. And if you're a commercial airline and you don't want your passengers to be freaking out because Chinese military jets are following you, well, they have to request permission from the CCP. The strategy that other countries used to break through that was to just ignore it. The United States just flew planes through that area regardless and encouraged its allies to do the same. Japan, Taiwan, and other countries, they ignore it. They've learned that the Chinese Communist Party is full of a bunch of hot air, and that, while they may harass them, they don't do anything. And also, the United States and other countries are doing the same thing against the Chinese Communist Party and its claims to territorial ownership of the nearby waters. Again, the CCP claims territorial ownership of the entire South China Sea, that whole region. They're building artificial islands and then claiming defensive zones around the islands, including territorial ownership of waters. Other countries, again, that also claim ownership over certain islands and certain shoals and otherwise, well, they're just ignoring the CCP, and some of them are still having pretty tense battles. But the strategy is what is referred to as freedom of navigation operations. They just sail their ships through regardless. Fishing boats, military boats, Coast Guard boats, they ignore the Chinese Communist Party. And if you were to understand that as relation to a possible blockade of Taiwan, well, other countries might just do what they're doing already, which is ignore the Chinese Communist Party. And so if the Chinese Communist Party were to say, for example, blockade of Taiwan, nobody gets in, nobody gets out, other countries could say, we're not going to listen to you, we're ignoring you, and we're going to do it anyway. And also, if you dare fire on the ships, that is a declaration of war, and the Hellscape system is waiting there for that shot to be fired. In other words, there's a bit of a mutual destruction if the CCP were to try that. Now look, with all this said, there's also the fundamental question of whether or not the United States would actually defend Taiwan in the event of a CCP invasion. Because all this said, it all hinges on the very idea of whether the U.S. would actually defend Taiwan in the first place. Now, I'll be talking about this, though, in the rest of this episode, which will be available on EpochTV.com. So if you're watching on YouTube, Facebook, Rumble, or X, click the link in the description to get access to the rest of this episode. And not only will you get access to the rest of my show, you'll also get access to our investigations, our reports on the Chinese Communist Party, and also its plans to subvert the United States of America. We've been at the forefront of exposing the CCP's infiltration tactics. In fact, in our documentary, The Final War, we trace back to the beginning of the Chinese Communist Party to reveal its 100-year plot to defeat the United States of America. And if you'd like to watch that and understand what the Chinese Communist Party is doing, you can watch the Final War documentary on EpochTV.com. Let me show you a quick trailer for the Final War before we continue the rest of this episode on EpochTV.com, and I'll see you all there.
The greatest threat facing the United States is the CCP.
The Epoch Times investigation team had studied the CCP for years, but what we uncovered was yielding evidence beyond our imagination.
With Chairman Mao, with the Prime Minister, our talks have been characterized by frankness.
The Clinton administration said, oh, don't worry about it. This will be a poison pill for China.
China's strategic goal is to make sure that the U.S. has 4 enemies, and one of them must be a terrorist group.
We are giving of our life's blood so that the Chinese Communist Party can survive and thrive.